Thank you so much. And I just want to express my thanks to the New Zealand Drug Foundation and all the sponsors for sponsoring me to come all the way from America to New Zealand for the first time. I have learned a ton about your culture, your very rich culture, and really just the generosity of spirit, really of everybody that I've met, whether or not you agree with me or not. And hopefully some of you have realized that what you've read on Google is a little bit different from my impression in person, I hope. But I'm really excited to be here. I think the act that you may be even more excited to hear about is tomorrow, and I'm thrilled to be joined by one of the smartest guys in the drug policy discussion today, Steve Rawls from the UK. Tomorrow afternoon, or tomorrow around 11, I think, is our sort of billed as the great debate. So now is sort of the more boring bit. Just kind of talking about the evidence and those things that we really actually should be paying attention to. They're important. Ross, again, thank you. I find it interesting, though, that you're the first person to get the gift. You're the first person and the last person to be shown on the screen. You're always coming up. But I think it's well-deserved because he actually represents all of you very, very well and your country well. We go back many, many years, different UN meetings, and really bringing in a lot of experience and also a lot of the knowledge that the world has gained from New Zealand and really this whole region on cannabis is pretty astounding because I don't think a lot of people would realize that a part of the world that may be sometimes neglected when it comes to research is such a powerhouse in this specific field, and it's also I'm humbled to be in the here on the program with many of the researchers here who have shaped and actually formed my thinking. So moving on, I'm going to speed through we only have less than half an hour. The first part about why marijuana or cannabis even matters in the first place, because I think we've sort of gone over that over the last 2 days with the research. But actually, it may be helpful if you get a copy of the presentation later just to refer to. I think there are 4 main phases that we need to be concerned with here. It's pregnancy, which I haven't heard as much about, latency, adolescence, and adulthood. I think we've already gone over some of the major harms. So again, I'm not going to talk in detail about them. But I think one of the things that certainly yesterday, Nadia and Wayne and others, David talked about is really this issue of why we care about this in the first place is because of the developing brain. Because we know that brains before around 25 to 28 have not formed who they're going to be for the rest of their life. So this is a critical period for people, right? It's the reason why if you learn a second language, you learn that when you're 4 rather than maybe when you're 40 or 50, when it's a lot harder to learn that. Or when you learn to swim or bike ride, it's probably you're going to have much more chances of being successful at those activities when you start before you're age 10 versus if you wait to learn to swim when you're 50 or 60. It's the same thing with drugs, right? All drugs have the potential, and they don't do it in all cases, right? We've talked about the relative risk, but they have the potential to essentially hijack the brain in a much greater risk for that before that brain is fully primed and before it's become the brain that it will be for really the rest of its life, fully formed by around age 30 or a little bit before then. So that's why we care. Let's see here. This is going to be working. We'll move forward from here on the data. I think, one of the things, too, we heard a little bit about the addictive nature of drugs, and I just thought it might be interesting to, if you can see that, sort of look at comparisons with other substances. The marijuana number, the cannabis, 15%, that's the 1 in 6 number that Wayne and others have been constantly referring to, about the same as alcohol, not nearly as high as drugs like cocaine, tobacco, or heroin. But I think it's interesting nonetheless to sort of look at that relative risk. I'll go back. I get, when I talk about this in front of schools and in front of young people, I get a lot of young people who say, wait a minute, 1 in 6? I'm one of the 5 out of 6 then, right? I'm gonna be fine. My friends and I are not part of the 1 in 6 that actually get into, have troubles with cannabis, and folks say I don't know anybody that really is part of that 1 in 6. And then I ask them a very interesting question because it just sort of, I think, reflects our social norms. I asked those same kids, well, what do you think the chances of getting into a car crash if you're drunk is? In other words, every day, out of all of the incidences of drinking and driving, and not any alcohol, I mean enough to impair, right? I know you're having that debate here, 0.05, 0.08, around that and higher, what is the chance that you will get into a fatal car crash? And I hear for these very same kids who think 1 in 6 is really a low number, they say things like 1 in 2, 1 in 3, incidences, isn't it so common? And obviously there's a huge social norm. Well, actually, what's interesting is that compared to drinking and driving, it's a lot more risky, which is fascinating. We know that for every incident of risky drinking and driving, there are about between 299 and 999 instances where there is no fatal car crash, which I think is very interesting. And there's obviously a big range depending on what numbers you use, but conservatively about 1 in 300. Other numbers closer to 1 in 1,000, but I think that is sort of sometimes a bit of a wake-up call for young people who think they're invincible, and that 1 in 6 really is something that they can beat. I just think it's important to do that. And before I get into talking really about community-based prevention, which is going to be the crux of my discussion, I'll get some of the bit more controversial bits out of the way in the beginning, and we'll move on. But this issue of, as Steve was talking about earlier and others, does policy matter? I think is a bit of a superficial question. I think we have to go deeper in terms of really looking at what policies where in what forms, rather than something sort of as generic as just does policy matter. And one experience I think we can look at is the experience of the U.S. decriminalization of marijuana, which really happened. 12 states decriminalized marijuana in the United States in the 1970s in a very rapid manner. I mean, this was a time where attitudes about cannabis just changed dramatically from the sort of, I guess, more innocent era of the 50s and early 60s to the a bit more abrasive and sort of social unrest in the United States in the mid-60s to the mid to late 70s. And with that, cannabis represented all sorts of things, mainly the establishment, anti-establishment, anti-war, the Vietnam War. These histories in America are very, very important. And basically, in that time period, this sort of wave of decriminalization hit many states, in fact, even including many states in the Midwest that we would never think, more conservative states, this happened. And essentially, the research in the beginning really just focused on, was there an effect, right? Sort of this question that we were asking earlier, does policy have an effect? Did the 12 states that changed actually show anything on the ground? There was some very early evidence by Karen Modell and her colleagues at RAND showing some increased ER admissions for cannabis in those states, but by and large, the research actually found no effect of decriminalization on these states, which is, I think, very interesting, and what has been used a lot, I think, to justify the kind of meme that, hey, policy, really doesn't matter when it comes to use patterns. I think what, though, is very interesting when we look at this is that the more recent data actually showed that it's not so much does policy matter, you have to back up a little bit and ask, do you even know what the policy is? In other words, if you think something is going to have an effect, something like policy have an effect on someone's ability to or desire to use, they have to know if that policy changed in the first place. And we didn't really ask that question when we were doing the early studies. Some other folks, like Rosalie Pakula, Rob McCune, actually did ask that question and found a very interesting outcome, which was essentially that people had no idea whether their state had decriminalized or not. So if you're trying to find an effect on whether that policy had a change, well, if they didn't even know there was a change in policy, how can we try and expect to achieve see an effect in the result? When I did my undergraduate at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, and of course California is decriminalized for 40 years. And we were asked this question in my class, actually Rob McCune was my teacher. We were asked, this somewhat smart group of people here at Berkeley, okay. I guess there were some exceptions like me, but anyway, we were asked, do you think marijuana is decriminalized in California? In other words, are there criminal penalties? And can you go to prison for low-level amounts of possession? And almost everybody raised their hands thinking that you could go to prison and that there wasn't decriminalization. Again, this is a cohort, a group that were very interested in drug policy. And they sort of have a predisposition to maybe knowing a little bit or at least being somewhat interested to do some of the readings. And that also confirmed, I think, what his studies showed, which was that people didn't really know. Furthermore, to complicate that question, I think, of does policy matter even more, as if we didn't, we needed it to get more complicated, the issue is that when you actually examine the laws on the ground, there's very little connection between decriminalization in a certain state, like X state has decriminalized, and actually what the law really is on the ground. So what's interesting is that in many states where there is no decriminalization law, in other words, it's criminal penalties, the reality on the ground is you have a much less likely, the risk of being arrested or having some kind of criminal sanction is actually sometimes far less than the state that was supposed to be soft. So I just say this because I think this illustrates how difficult these questions can sometimes, are, and how difficult drug policy generally is. And when we try and sort of use policy to inform a program on the ground like prevention, it just gets very, very sticky. And obviously tomorrow we'll get into more details with Steve about whether or not that matters at all, whether we should care. But one other, I think, just kind of more recent example of people who do know about their laws really is in the issue of medical cannabis in the US. So there's been really some mixed data, some early studies showing really no effect of medical cannabis on use rates. Although the more recent data, again by the same researchers that looked at the decrim literature, like Rosa Lee, and I should have put her name up here on the second bullet, has essentially found with more sophisticated analyses that two main characteristics did predict higher rates of use. It wasn't, again, so much as there is this law, do people use drugs more or not? That, again, that's too simplistic. Essentially what it was is what characteristics of this law might contribute to increases in use. And what they found is you needed two characteristics, and actually you did show the increase when you controlled for all other factors. Those included home cultivation, and I think the second and more important characteristic was this issue of retail sales. Right, so there are states in the US like New Mexico where there's no such thing as a medical marijuana dispensary. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Los Angeles lately, some of you. You might notice that there are more cannabis outlets for medical purposes in Los Angeles than there are Starbucks coffees outlets, and that's true. The same goes for Denver, right? So not all states are alike. You have to really look at the characteristics of what's going on. And so I think this sort of confirms what some of the Peter Reuter's research into the Netherlands in terms of commercialization, right? Showing that not so much the law, but more, do people know about the law? And is it a very radical change from something like a decrim? In other words, the sort of commercialization side. And certainly in places like Colorado and California, it's very hard to argue that there isn't commercialization. I mean, these are just two little ads. In fact, then they're targeting youth. When you look at the last time I checked, I don't think an 80-year-old granny with cancer would have been attracted to this woman here. Maybe some, but probably by and large, this is really targeted to youth and for commercialization. And I think when we talk about prevention, we have to realize what kinds of environments that we're delivering it in. It might be more difficult to deliver prevention in a context of, pot tarts and marijuana monkey grape soda, being targeted towards kids. And again, just to be fair, I know that, for example, in Steve's book that I think is available to you, I mean, he sort of points out the ridiculousn's. No matter where you stand on the policy, the sort of ridiculousness of the kind of marketing that is going on. And so again, when you look at prevention and you look at policy to see does policy actually affect prevention, well, when you're bombarded by that, it just might. And so the research on the early indications from medical marijuana, there's the Rosa Lee study, but there's also some things in JAMA Pediatrics Journal, for example, about the ER admissions for very small children. Basically getting their hands on what they thought were cupcakes mom made to take to school on her birthday, what ended up being, THC 30%. Cupcakes, yeah, probably we would all agree, no matter where you fall on the policy spectrum, that if you're 12, you probably shouldn't get your hands on that. And so we have seen some of these effects, the things like the drug-related referrals in Colorado, the early indicators from the last 2 years when they had the commercialization of medical marijuana, which happened in 2009. We've been seeing some increases as well as Colorado's always had a higher rate of use than the US as a whole. We're seeing that rapid, sort of 3 times higher than they used to have in this period of commercialization. I think the jury's still out. We have to see what the full effects are after many years. We need to do the studies that haven't been done on comparing that increase with neighboring states, right? So this just might be the increase in some other states, although this is the national average, so there is somewhat of a control there. But when we look at things like I was talking about with youth referrals, we do have to look at other states. We have to look at other factors that may be confounding. We have to, maybe counselors are looking for kids with marijuana on them now because they're worried about medical marijuana. And there are a lot of things that we obviously have to tease. I think it just illustrates the fact that this is hard stuff. Anybody presenting a, I think, bumper sticker solution to any of this, including prevention, you should, I think, be a bit wary of. If I were to say there's sort of one truism, at least in the United States, I'm not as familiar with the data here on this, but I think the sort of the one truism in terms of attitudes in young people that's really hard to dispute, and I haven't heard a good dispute for it, is that essentially the perceived risk, harmfulness of a substance seems to mirror whether or not that population uses or not. In other words, the riskier you think it is to take a drug, whatever that drug is, the less likely you are to use. And this is, we're fortunate to have somewhat decent data systems for this kind of thing in the US. This is the same study that's been going on since the early to mid-70s, asking the exact same question to kids in the exact same grades. And essentially finding, remember, this is during the time I was talking about with the big push for decrim and actually legalization was in the 70s. That was the last time, in addition to now. And the perceived risk, hit sort of a record low. We're not even that low now. About 10% of high school seniors perceived cannabis as risky. And then when you look at their correlation with use, it's about 50% use. And then that is exactly mirrored, for example, during this time of sort of getting tough on drugs in the late 80s. There was sort of this general thought that all drugs, including cannabis, were very risky, and that's reflected here, and then the use levels were at their lowest. And we're seeing this again now. We're seeing that this is only 2010, but if this went off to 2012, we'd be around here, sorry for those on the right of the room, and the perceived risk has gone down. So those two things seem to correlate, which is, again, an interesting thing to know when you're trying to actually implement prevention. So we heard earlier about the fact that there are some prevention programs, like in school and in other settings, that are cost effective. John Calkins did a good review of all of them and essentially found that they're pretty cost effective, but are they actually very effective? And there's a difference between cost effectiveness and effectiveness. And maybe is there something better than just prevention delivered in a traditional way? So right in the US, you've heard of the DARE classes. That's sort of been the model for a lot of places where you sort of go in, give a few classes, a few lessons during a health class, and kind of expect youth to be inoculated from using drugs. In the US, we sort of had a wake-up call about a lot of this stuff. During our last, I would say before the current prescription drug epidemic, which is currently the biggest problem in the US, the last epidemic really as being the crack epidemic in the mid-'80s. I mean, this consumed American culture, political culture, the media, social culture, et cetera, in the mid to late 1980s, right? The US was transfixed on this issue of crack. And there's a lot of discussion about why that was. Some people think it had the race element. It was sort of the suburbs being really scared about the scary urban parts kind of bleeding into their areas, and will their precious children be exposed to crack like the inner city kids? And then there was a lot of awareness, for whatever reason, there was a lot of awareness around this new way to ingest cocaine. By basically baking it with some baking soda and putting it into a pipe and smoking it, which is all it is cocaine with a little bit of baking soda and baked up. And so this did consume us, and I think actually, we can have a separate discussion on this, I think actually derailed the last legalization push, which really was in the 70s in a very major way. I think this derailed that for 25 or so years. But more importantly, I think what it did was really wake communities and schools up to the fact that prevention cannot be single issue, single sort of shot programs delivered only in a school setting. Because what you had with crack were so many parts of the community affected in different ways that if every one of those parts knew how the other parts were affected, there might be a much better response. So prevention folks or teachers had no idea what was going on at the treatment centers. All they knew was this was wreaking havoc among a certain population. Law enforcement was not keeping track with teachers or treatment workers. They were too busy, trying to go after users and dealers of crack at that time and implement, things like mandatory minimums. The faith-based community, this was brand new to them, but they were seeing their own people in their church have problems. People come to them with their problems, and they were seeing this in very large numbers. So it's sort of forced upon, I would argue, the United States to look at this, and this is sort of only an American perspective, it's a perspective I bring, but hopefully it's somewhat useful here. It sort of brought this heightened concern in the community for the fact that different sectors really had to get around a table and talk to each other. That actually hadn't happened, that maybe prevention should be planned by these different sectors and delivered in these different places in the community, right? So community-based prevention was born, really, I think, out of the crack epidemic. And so Lloyd Johnston, who's the dean, I would say, in the U.S. of statistics on young people and users, he's been running the same survey for 45 years, looking at use patterns. Essentially, I think hits the nail on the head when he said, as the field of prevention has matured, it has been recognized that any single strategy is unlikely to succeed, and a reinforcing set of strategies has the greatest potential to reduce use. And so this sort of idea, I think that really encapsulates, what this idea, and I know you have a version of this in New Zealand. I was talking about it with one of the leaders of that program yesterday. But essentially, what we call them and what we call these groups that come together are community coalitions, right? A coalition is a group of various groups all under one umbrella. And so essentially the sort of standard definition, it's a formal arrangement for cooperation and collaboration between groups in the community, right? Between very, very different groups who then work together towards a common goal. There are many, many sectors. It's not just the four that I mentioned. Obviously law enforcement, but business has a role to play. The media has a role to play. Faith-based communities, volunteer groups, state, local, tribal agencies, youth-serving organizations, right? Places where kids can go, the famous example of midnight basketball in the inner city during the crack epidemic, right? How did something like midnight basketball get organized? Well, it became different sectors in the community got together and figured out the times that kids were at highest risk and why they were doing what they were doing. It was actually outside of school hours, and it was a time when, very late at night when they thought they could get away with it. So providing alternative activities in that community context tended to be pretty effective. That's just sort of one small example of this. Again, so they bring together community sectors to carry out and Steve talked about this earlier, population level strategies. So it's not just concerned about this group that you have in front of you, right? The students that you're actually teaching that's listening to your one message once a month. It's instead a variety of interventions designed to make population level change. So the scale and scope has to be pretty large, right? Because again, it's not a small scale, it's large scale. It identifies and addresses we talked again earlier about this, the risk factors as well as the protective factors. When we say environment in this field, what we mean by that, what is the lighting like in the community when kids are coming home from tutoring sessions at 5 p.m. when it gets dark in some parts of the country? Is there adequate lighting in certain places? And if not, how does bad lighting contribute to dealing in the community and changing community norms about drug use? I mean, it's sort of those kinds of innovative things versus, how can we most scare somebody in a classroom setting into not using drugs? It's really looking at the variety of causes and factors, some of them actually structural. How is public housing built, right? Are there large parts of public housing that don't have adequate lighting, that places, frankly, that it's easy to hide, that could facilitate drug dealing? How do health care interventions get implemented in the community? If some kid does have a problem, do they have to go to the nurse during 1 hour of the open office hours, or is there a community-based place where they can actually present with a problem? So it really is sort of looking at, so again, in the past, we've seen the individually focused interventions providing, which are obviously important, but the issue is all of them together need to be implemented. So providing information, building skills, providing social support, all very important. But what about things like barriers, like I was talking about with the open air parks or the lighting, the consequences and incentives? What are the incentives for certain businesses that might facilitate, and we're talking about things also like liquor outlets. What are the incentives for businesses like liquor outlets to have 10 liquor outlets in a socioeconomically deprived community? And what are the consequences if they do that? That's an important question to ask. I mean, I will just say I did a little bit of research around the sort of the New Zealand data, and what I found was very similar to what we have in the U.S. I found the paper that showed that in New Zealand there are 6 times as many tobacco outlets in poor socioeconomic areas than there are in upper class white areas. That's the same thing in the U.S. Actually, we're a little worse. We're more like 8 to 1, and that's for liquor. So 8 times as many liquor store outlets in poor black communities in the U.S. and Hispanic communities versus upper class white communities. Policies and rules, the physical design of the environment, some of these things that I mentioned. These are the environmental strategies that are really used to change the environment, right? The context of which substance abuse can occur. So it's a comprehensive data-driven approach. I think, again, in the past, we've sort of run from one drug to another. Like, this is the big drug right now that we hear about. Kids are telling us, as opposed to a data-driven exercise. I think this field generally suffers from the fact that we are sometimes driven by our own experiences or our own emotions versus looking actually at the population level data that we have. And obviously people have different experiences with things, and that's important to recognize and realize. But when you're implementing policy, which prevention is, you do have to look at sort of the data. And, famous quote, the plural of anecdote is not data, I think is important to remember. So it's these people coming around a table and essentially saying, all right, what is our local problem? Is it MDMA? Is it cannabis? Is it alcohol? Is it all of these things to some extent? What are the kinds of things we need to focus on here? Is it tobacco? And so again, just a sort of comparison in terms of the scale of programs and coalitions. So coalitions measure success by community level indicators. What is the drug use rate in the community and the harms rate? What are the consequences? So when you go to a community near where I live in Boston, and you notice that there's a massive opiate problem and now being replaced with a heroin problem coming back, because now the opiates are getting more expensive, the prescription drugs, and so it's being replaced with cheaper heroin. What are the interventions there that can help? That's going to be different than when you go to San Diego, California, and you see in certain populations the huge issue with methamphetamines, which is not an issue still on the East Coast. It really is not. So you do have to look at that and see what those indicators are depending on the community that you're in. They address multiple causes, as I think I've mentioned, and there are different actors that act in the community to implement that change, right? So the onus isn't on the teacher to deliver the health class or the police officer sometimes to deliver the health class. The onus is on the entire community. So what's the responsible business in the Chamber of Commerce doing to make sure that there isn't a cluster of liquor stores around a school, right? What's the school board doing to ensure that the environment at school, for example, when someone's caught, what happens to them? What is that entire environment? Sorry about the colors here that you can't see. So there is some data, by the way, showing that this is not just a good idea, it kind of works. And so when communities are looked at, so this is, the way that it works in the United States actually is very interesting. It didn't start with a government program at all. The government had nothing to do with it for 15 years. It was local communities like in South Central Los Angeles who were forced to deal with it in this way. And these communities started growing by the dozens and by the hundreds, organically with no funding. I mean, these were communities that essentially, these coalitions acted because the different organizations that already had funding and their own existing mechanisms would essentially have lunch together once a week. I mean, that's sort of the idea. So it started very organically, and then, I would say about 10 years later, there was enough sort of lobbying that the government actually came in and said, all right, we're going to fund in a very small amount, not you to go and develop a curriculum to deliver in a school. We're going to fund you to have a central coordinator, a very modest amount of money, to bring people together around a room, like I said, a few times a month, and plan what you're going to do with basically existing resources or leverage other resources. And this program became to be known as what it is today, which is called the Drug-Free Communities Program. And it's really one of the only federally funded prevention programs anymore in the US, actually, which is very interesting. But anyhow, so when they've had to sort of, in order to justify, especially these days in the US with the budgets the way they are, in order to sort of justify the ongoing, and it's very small. I mean, if you sort of look at the relatively to other programs, I mean, it's just a drop in the bucket. But essentially, still having to justify their funding, they found that especially in middle school, but also in high school, when compared to areas that did not have these grants, that were not doing this, and controlling for other confounding factors, there was a significant reduction in the three things that they were looking at, because these are the main abusable substances among youth: alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis. And then prescription drugs is something that they're looking at now. Just how much time do I have now? I'm sort of done. Okay. I shouldn't have. See, that's the problem when you ask a question. I'm gonna go forward, but essentially, maybe I can give you 2 more minutes. I was just going to show you some local examples, which we don't have time to go through, but essentially in a place like Southern California, where after medical marijuana, there was now a cluster of stores. It was sort of these coalitions that came together and said, okay, we're not opposing medical marijuana. What we're opposing is 25 different outlets within a 3-block area of a school. So, what do we do to make sure that that isn't the case? And so that, they implemented these environmental programs and actually showed declines in marijuana use at a time where there weren't those declines in the rest of the U.S. So I'm going to just go forward to the end here in terms of what was implemented. So this has been actually done internationally. Not only, the exact model. Now, there are modifications of the model, again, like I know in New Zealand. I'm not sure about Australia or other countries, but certainly this model has been used throughout now, over 20 countries in Latin America, Europe, and even in places like Central Asia now, which is really interesting in this so-called stands. And there are about 80 or so there. I wasn't sure whether I needed to focus on prevention, but also talk about intervention and treatment. So I'm going to just not talk about this so much, other than I think what's interesting when you look at U.S. data, I would be very surprised if it was different here in New Zealand. And I'm just going to shift gears to treatment for a minute, because we were talking earlier, Steve and others were talking about this. I think what's interesting is that the vast majority of people who essentially, when you ask them questions about their patterns of use, would qualify as problematic drug users in need of treatment, over 94% of them don't feel they need it. I think that's just an interesting finding. I'd be surprised if it's different here. So yes, there's a need to actually have more treatment, and the question was asked by Dr. Fraser, why don't we do this? Why don't we scale these things up? Why don't we offer this? And that is a legitimate question that we have to ask. But again, the reason why the environment matters and social norms matter is people sort of need to know that they actually have a problem, before we might expect them to seek treatment or not. And right now, again, I don't think that's happening. And I won't go into details about the brief interventions, but I think there's some good data on things like motivational interviewing and other issues. So I think my time is up. I packed a lot into that, and I know I speak with you wouldn't know I'm from the West Coast of the U.S. I speak with the speed of a New Yorker, so I'm sorry about that. But I appreciate you listening to me, and I look forward to questions and also tomorrow. Thank you. Want me to stay? Sure.
Again, do we have a couple of or 2 or 3 quick questions?
Steve, you can't ask a question. That'll be for tomorrow.
There'll be plenty of time tomorrow for things. Have you got a question? Yes? Okay.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was really good. I'd really just like to ask your opinion on the imprisonment rates in the US when you've got 1.6 million prisoners and 330,000 in there for drug offences. Just like your opinion on that.
Sure. I'm very happy to talk about incarceration rates. I don't know what necessarily is the link with prevention, but I'm more than happy to address it. I think it's embarrassing, the incarceration rate in the U.S., more than embarrassing. We have 5 times the number of, we have 5 times the record rate of imprisonment in the United States than the average OECD country. We also have 5 times the imprisonment rate than our historical average. In other words, from the founding of America to now, averaged out, divided by years, we're 5 times greater. What I think, though, is sort of the mistake is the giant leap that's often taken. I'm going to mention cannabis because that's what we're here to talk about. That if somehow we changed our laws and legalized or regulated cannabis, that would go a long way in reducing that rate. The issue with that, and we looked about this in the Obama, when I served as a senior advisor for President Obama, who is no fan of over-incarceration and is acutely aware of the issues in the inner city and in disproportionate impacts. We were charged to look at this, right? How does marijuana and other drugs contribute? Well, first of all, in state and federal prison, in terms of the numbers that you just cited, the 1.6 or so, essentially it was found that those who were there for marijuana only and no other drugs or no other crime at the time, no other serious crime, were minuscule. that was very, very difficult to find somebody languishing in prison for low levels amount of marijuana. Now, if they had prior offenses or they were on what we call probation, I'm not sure if you have that here, conditional release. In other words, you sort of let go, but then you can't drink, you can't use marijuana, you can't do all these things. But when those people have diminished freedom because of their past, but for the average person with low levels of amount, it's very difficult to find. Then we went further, and actually, what about all drug offenses? I mean, let's look at cocaine, crack, heroin, meth, etc. And yes, 20%, now 18%, actually it's been declining in the last 3 years, thankfully, but about 20% of people in American prisons and jails are there primarily for drug offenses. And when you do the math based on what I was just talking about with the OECD number, if we were to let out every single drug offender, including crack dealers, heroin dealers, MDMA dealers, we would not have 5 times the number of our historical average or our OECD average. We'd have 4 times. So even with all drugs, and Mark Kleiman has also used that number, even with all drugs, which we do need to reduce things. I think we have mandatory minimums for crack and powder cocaine that might have been justified in 1987 when thousands of people were dying, but probably aren't justified now. And so that's why I've come out in favor of repealing those mandatory minimums, in favor of drug courts over incarceration, in favor of no sanctions for low-level users that don't show harm to the community. But I think our myopic focus, this is on cannabis or even all drugs, really belies the fact that there are many, many more structural issues. So when I go in the inner city, actually, and talk about this, and someone in the audience says, well, why not legalization? The response from the people actually living in the community is, why would we replace one problem, one travesty, incarceration, with another travesty, a public health problem? That's the answer that I get when I talk to many of those communities. So, thank you.
Right, that's probably all we've got time
All right,
for.
thanks
That one,
very
sorry,
much.
we'll have more
Sure.
of this tomorrow, of course.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Kevin.